So as you could tell, this weekend, since I have on the violet colors, we begin the new church year with the first Sunday of Advent. And the lesson of Advent is very simply to call to mind the three comings of Christ. The first coming in history, 2,000 years ago. The second coming in mystery, now. And the third coming at the end of time. And this weekend we have a wonderful opportunity to concentrate on what I think is more like the second coming in mystery, or the present day Adventists, where Christ appears to us in the poor, for example, and their cry to be cared for, or in the witness of the saints, or in good preaching, or in the sacraments, but most especially in the Holy Eucharist, the presence par excellence of Christ. And so this weekend we have the relics here of Blessed Carlo Acutis and Saint Manuel Gonzalez, two very Eucharistic saints. And I'd like to talk especially about the second coming of Christ, or the coming in mystery right now, particularly through the example of Blessed Carlo Acutis. Carlo was born in London on May 3rd, 1991. So many of us were alive at the time of his birth. His parents were Andrea and Antonia Acutis. They were a young Italian couple whose jobs had led them to work in England. His parents were not practicing Catholics, but they had Carlo baptized in the usual way just because it was sort of a social thing to do on May 15th of that year. When Carlo got older, he spoke of baptism in this way. He said, "It is a very important thing because it allows souls to be saved through their insertion into the divine life. People participating in a baptism focus too often on the confetti, the candy, and the white robe, which are a part of the festivities, but they do not seek to understand the meaning of this great gift bestowed by God on humanity." Well, shortly after Carlo was born, in September of 1991, his family returned to Milan, Italy. Carlo's family was pretty well-to-do, and so he was materially very comfortable, and he grew up in a pretty social environment. He went to school in Milan and was taught by the Ursuline nuns. And although his parents did not practice their faith, Carlo learned much from those Ursuline sisters, and eventually, at age 7, he received his first Holy Communion. Again, mind you, his parents were not practicing the faith. Well, from that day on, he recited the rosary fervently, and he went to daily Mass. His devotion, even at such an early age, impressed all those who witnessed it. And what was fascinating is that even though his parents did not practice their faith, Carlo remained faithful to daily Mass from the time he was 7 years old by finding a grown-up to accompany him. He would go around the neighborhood and ask, "Would you come to Mass with me? Would you take me to Mass?" And so he brought people to Mass at age 7 and beyond. Even as a little boy, he showed the greatest respect for the poor, the weak, and the abandoned. His piety did not deter him from being a normal young boy, though. He enjoyed playing soccer, he taught himself how to play the saxophone, but his greatest enjoyment was the computer. He loved everything he could do on the computer. He made use of his talents not as an end in themselves, but as his way of glorifying God and helping others, always with a very modest attitude and with great intelligence. Now, as a teenager, Carlo formed many friendships with both boys and girls, but always within the boundaries of an uncompromising chastity. At the age of 14, he went to a Jesuit high school where he flourished in his studies, as well as in helping others. He spent hours tutoring other students. He spent many hours developing software for his friends. Again, his computer skills were extremely good. He especially enjoyed video games. But he limited himself to 1 hour a week as a penance and to keep away from any of the pitfalls of the internet. Now I ask you, how many 14-year-old boys do you know who love playing video games would limit themselves to 1 hour a week on that video game? I think that's pretty amazing that he would do that. Anyway, he was very generous in helping his classmates with their studies. And through all of this, Carlo's spiritual life was centered on the daily Mass. He would often say, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Souls can sanctify themselves very effectively thanks to the fruits of the daily Eucharist. That way, they do not risk finding themselves in the kind of peril that would jeopardize their eternal salvation." 14 years old. This is what this kid was thinking about. He would often spend time praying before the Blessed Sacrament, hours before the Blessed Sacrament in prayer. He worked tirelessly at bringing people back to Mass who had fallen away, including his parents, eventually, who came back, and many of his friends who came back during his life, but also many of his friends returned to Mass after his death. He even was very instrumental in converting one of his family servants from being a Hindu to the Catholic faith. He was fascinated by Eucharistic miracles. And so he took it upon himself to use his great computer skills to create a website focused on Eucharistic miracles. It is incredibly beautiful. You ought to look it up. Just Google it. You can find it. There's so much more that could be said about this young teenager. But he ended up contracting one of the most aggressive forms of cancer in October of 2006. And within 2 weeks, he was dead at the age of 15 and a half on October 11th. He was beatified on October 10th, 2020, just 2 years ago. Now, we need examples like this young man today to bring people back to the Holy Eucharist. Carlo was so in love with our Lord in the Holy Eucharist and Our Lady through the Rosary that his every breath was spent trying to bring others to Jesus. I'm sure many of you are aware that just a couple of years ago, a survey showed that 70% of Catholics do not believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. 70%. Blessed Carlo Acutis is an example to us of the importance of the real presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist. When we receive the Holy Eucharist, we are receiving the very heart of Jesus Christ. When we receive his body, blood, soul, and divinity, his life permeates our lives down to the very depths of our hearts. And the devil knows this. And so he tries every trick that he can to keep people away from the Holy Eucharist. So we have to pray for and invite and encourage people to return to Mass. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This Advent, let's make a concerted effort to experience the second coming of Christ, the coming in mystery, especially in the Holy Eucharist. Blessed Carlo Acutis is a beautiful example of doing this, especially when he was drawn to the Holy Mass, even when his own parents were away from the faith. It did not stop him. If we do this, it will certainly make Christmas far more meaningful this year to each one of us.